right, thanks everybody again for coming out. It's my honor to introduce our closing speaker today. And in fact, he probably doesn't need much of an introduction to all of you. If you're from Missoula and you're into conservation, you've probably seen him around. And if you haven't seen him here, maybe you've seen him in Outside Magazine or on The Tonight Show, or perhaps hosting the 4-part series on energy on the Discovery Channel. So Sanjan has an extensive experience in Africa and Asia and North America, and especially with respect to protecting habitats in nature and large landscapes. And today he wants to talk to you a little bit about that. So thanks, Sanjan.
Thank you. So we'll try and do this as open it up to the audience and have questions come at us as well. And there's several people here who I'm sure will be able to offer stuff, offer insights better than anything I could do. So I'll give you a little snapshot of what I think is going on in the conservation movement, sort of as an end, so that we can then carry on the discussion as we go and go out to happy hour Friday evening, brave the snow. You know, I think I've told the story before. It's a true story. You know, I was born on an island, and I was born a stone throw away from the Indian Ocean. And when I was born, my grandmother took me to an astrologer and looked at my head. And they read the pattern of hair growth on my head, which is something they do. In some island cultures, I've heard the Hawaiian cultures do it as well, but I've not heard this widespread anywhere else. And they read this hair pattern, and then they make predictions about your life. And unfortunately for me, my grandmother, who's the matriarch of the family, comes back and tells my family that I would die by drowning, which is not good if you live on an island. It's great if you live in Montana. So I made my move here, and that's why I live here now. So as a kid, I wasn't allowed to go in the ocean. I was allowed to go up to the ocean, but I couldn't actually go inside it, in it, at all. And it was kind of a traumatic thing for a little kid as you grow up, and all your friends can do it, and your family can do it, and you're on an island as well. And then when I was about 9 years old, by then my parents had moved to Africa, to West Africa, and my mother broke with convention and got me swimming lessons and taught me how to swim. And you know, I've gone on to host Shark Week for Discovery Channel. It sort of tells you how far. Now, see, this astrologer said I would die in the sea. He didn't know whether I'd get eaten by a shark or whether it was actual drowning. So there's some, but you know, it's a sea change, quite literally, from what I started with to what I managed to do in my own life. And I've always attempted to deal with life in that same way, with sort of enthusiasm and optimism, trying to look at the future and saying, what do we need to get ready for it? Now, the funny thing is, if you look at what my parents did, it's very logical, right? Your kid's going to die from drowning, keep him out of the water. It's a pretty simple way of keeping him safe. But if I went around here and I told all of you, look, you know this is how you're going to meet your end, what would you want to do? Would you want to learn how to swim? I think most of us would want to have that chance. We'd want a fighting chance. We'd want to know how to swim, even if the odds were stacked against you. In a lot of ways, that's where I see us in the environmental movement today. We know what the future is going to hold for us. The death of the planet has been foretold many times over. And now the question is, do we want to cling to our outmoded ideas about how we just sort of wish the world would work? Or do we really want to tackle that quite head on and try to ask ourselves, well, what is it really going to take to make that change, make that difference, and give ourselves a fighting chance? So I want to just tell you why I think we're in where we're at in terms of the environmental movement, and then I want to talk to you a little bit about, as a student, as a scientist, the things I think that I feel like a couple of things that are missing right now that you can actually incorporate into what you do that would make you more effective conservationists. So I started in conservation biology, and I still do a little bit of science. It's mostly stuff I publish, I co-author with other colleagues. So usually it's the ideas that I bring to the table. They, quite honestly, do much of the hard work. And that's fine, and I'm happy doing that. But I also work for the largest conservation organization in the world. By a long shot, it is. We raise like, $500 million a year for conservation. We have 4,000 staff. It's an astonishingly powerful institution. So I know, and all my colleagues are in organizations that are peer organizations at WCS or CI or WWF, and I know what they deal with as well. And so I've seen it really from the front end of where the rubber meets the road in terms of, private, fast, innovative conservation. And what I see out there, I sort of ask myself, all right, so the Conservancy, Nature Conservancy has been around for 60 years. Why haven't we got more done? Right? We've had successes. Without a doubt, we've had lots of successes. And I want to diminish the success of the environmental community, the environmental movement. But why haven't we done more? This is the stuff you guys are devoting your life to. It's Friday afternoon, you're here, and you're going to, you're sitting here listening to this. So clearly this matters to you. And what you don't want to do is look back on your life and say, well, it didn't matter that much. You want it to matter, that's why you're here. That's why you call yourself a conservation biologist. And I struggle with this all the time, because I feel like there's so many things I want to do and I could do, and I struggle with it all the time, sort of saying, am I doing enough? Am I doing the right things? Am I working smart enough, hard enough? It really does drive me further faster. So I'm going to point out three things, and again, this is really open for debate and conversation, that I think that we sort of have got wrong a little bit, and that creates the problems that we see right now. So the first one is how we currently view nature. And this is something that others have pointed out. My colleague, Chris Filardi from the American Museum of Natural History, has pointed this out to me by showing me the cover of E.O. Wilson's book, which is this book, Biodiversity, and then this other book, Diversity of Life on Earth, which have these gorgeous covers of the full cathedral nature of life on Earth. Nature as a cathedral, gorgeous and dripping with biodiversity. Those are actually the words in there. And this vision that it evokes in us when you look at that, and the one thing you don't see in that cover is you don't see humans. So you don't see this agent of change, both positive and negative agent of change. You don't see them in that picture of biodiversity. Even the last speaker that we just heard just before I came on, the last slide he threw up there was about Native Americans and their influence on the landscape. And we're sitting in the back of the room thinking, what kind of landscape, what kind of impact they must have had on that landscape. It must have been tremendous as a predator, as a hunter, and then as a subsidizer for all these other animals out there. But I think that when we go into graduate school and we go into academia, we sort of forget that. It's maybe because our research drives us to these places, and even when they're not pristine, we still want to see them as pristine. We still want to see as humans as the interloper into that little fragment of canyon that Kevin was talking about. He talks about, the fact that he got thousands of photos of animals, but then he got tens of thousands of photos of people, right? And you still have that separation. That was almost, the way he said it, it made it sound like it was almost unexpected. Like, oh my God, can you believe it? We got it. We got all these people in there as well. And everyone cringed about it a little bit, right? So the way we view nature as this cathedral might be really wrong, and it might actually have set up a problem that we now are trying to get over and trying to solve using tools that are not designed for solving it. So keep that thought in mind. How we view nature. Where is our role in it? Are we firmly in the age of the Anthropocene, right? There's probably only 2 species on the planet that have been this massive in terms of terraforming the Earth. And we're certainly one of them, and that recognition should be there. The second thing I wanted to point out is, I mentioned this last night during the comment section of the panel, is how we view our interaction to nature, how we appreciate nature, how we see our role is as we interact with nature. And I think that for many of us, and I think this is now more than just in the US. I think if you go and talk to students from South Africa, or you talk to conservation students from Brazil, they will say the same thing. But I actually think they're parroting or mimicking a very Western view of how we see nature. And that is as a solitary pursuit, as something that is enjoyed alone and in quietness, in quiet solitude. Now, Ed Abbey, when he wrote Desert Solitaire, if you read his diary that he kept at the same time, he was pining for people. He was pining for his girlfriend, but he was still pining, right? Because he was alone, and he felt that loneliness of it. And I think that, humans being a social species and really embracing social interactions, I think there is a really odd way in which we want to now experience nature. Man alone in the wilderness, go out on a walk on your own, and all the stereotyped images sort of push that along. And it's not how most cultures see it. It's certainly not, immigrants to this country don't see it in that same way. And the example I gave last night is we go into a park in California or Colorado on a weekend, and you look at an Asian family or you look at a Hispanic family and look at how they are interacting with nature, and then look at how, the guy who's kitted out in a Patagonia outfit up on the trail, and look at his interaction with nature and look at the family's interaction with nature, it's different. And I think when you look at the world, I don't think the world is necessarily ready for the way we want to interact with nature, if we're trying to just export that idea and expect people to embrace it, right? So I just want you to think about how we appreciate nature and whether our model of appreciating nature, hey, I live in Montana for a reason. I like going out there in the woods and knowing that there's something big that might be stalking me. Kind of makes it kind of exciting a little bit, right? But it doesn't really necessarily work for everyone else on the planet. And then the last point is, how do we then go about trying to save it? So it turns out that if you look at the history of modern conservation, let's say the last 30, 40 years, there's really only two models of conservation that we've ever put forward. The first one is legislation. So a small group of people rally around one idea, they ring themselves around the White House, and they get Obama to defer action on the Keystone XL pipeline by 18 months. Right? And if they ring around the White House long enough, maybe they'll even get him to say, forget it, it's done. So legislative, that's a mandate, an executive order, but that's a similar kind of way. Virtually every time we go out and ban shark finning or end the ban on ivory or any of those things, or even create a national park. It's a small group of people, very dedicated, who lobby government very hard until a law is passed. Okay? The other model of conservation is what the Nature Conservancy and all the land trusts use, which is using private philanthropy, private money to go out and buy it, or some other form of buying it, like easements and all that kind of stuff. Basically paying someone to actually buy it. That's it. That's all we got in our toolbox. You either beat them over the head with a hammer, or you pay them off. Beat them over the head, pay them off. That's it. Those are really the two things. And I think that if you start looking at where conservation is heading now, what's exciting about it is that there are new models that are coming up, models that people are willing to scale up. Now, some of it you can just deride and say, all right, this ecosystem services stuff, well, that's just, smoke and mirrors stuff. But I really think that some of it really has application, and I've seen it in action, where payments for services were low, people who live downstream of a watershed pay communities who are upstream in order to protect a resource, where a community agrees to set aside a marine protected area for fisheries benefits that they then accrue over long periods of time, or for a grass bank to be created because a community can use it in times of drought, but year-round is open to wildlife as well. I can't tell you that there are models that are really big at scale. But now we're getting to the point where there are many models that you can then aggregate and say, well, in Latin America, water funds are now going to be applied in 30 cities. That covers probably 50 million people. Now you're trying to talk about real scale issues. Marine protected areas, I think, in the South Pacific has become something that communities are now wanting and implementing, even without the big NGOs trying to push them. It's spreading faster than conservation organizations can get in there and help with monitoring and implementation. So it's catching on its own. And those kinds of ideas, this other way of trying to protect nature, I think is really exciting. And I think it's exciting because it gives us new tools in this really worn toolbox that we need if we're going to try to create a bigger movement and, frankly, ultimately a more successful movement that's more inclusive in the way it goes about doing its work. So, those are the sort of, let me see. So those are sort of the three sort of big things I thought I would love to point out at the end of this session as we think about where we want to go. How do we view nature, really view nature? How do we see our role in nature? Do we have a place in it, or are we really apart from it? And then how do we try to create models of conservation that can actually last even once our backs are turned? Because the trickiest thing about doing conservation, particularly outside the US, is when you take money from the US and you export it over there, it'll work as long as the money keeps flowing. But once that money stops, then all hell breaks loose. So you want to figure out mechanisms that have intrinsic things built into them that'll keep them going, even after most of that money stops flowing. See, otherwise, what will happen is, like the Conservancy is a perfect example of it. Our growth, in terms of conservation, has perfectly mirrored our ability to raise money. So the more money we raise, the more work we do. And it's just like that, each one mirroring the other. And you'll never get there. You will never actually save as much as you want to save if you keep doing that. What you have to figure out a way is keep growing fundraising, but then divorce it from conservation. So conservation can go like that as everything else just goes on a nice steady climb. And if you can figure out mechanisms to do that, then you are really unlocking the power of making things happen at scale. So now let me just stop there and let's talk about a little bit about, as scientists and students, having listened to several talks yesterday and today, some really excellent talks about the work that all of you are doing. What do I see as a couple of things I think are hugely important when you step out from being a scientist and go out and trying to get some of that work implemented? And I think all of you in some way, shape, or form are already doing that. It's pretty hard to be at a place like University of Montana and not be engaged. So I don't mean to imply that all you do is sit in your lab and work on conservation and don't try and apply it. But there are probably 2 or 3 things that I think still are missing generally from conservation science that I'd like to see incorporated in a more thoughtful or systematic way. So the first of this is it's surprising, but I still think people need to be better storytellers. The best talks that we heard over the last 2 weeks, the last 2 days, were the best stories, right? I mean, it's just really that simple. It's the one you remember. It's the one you go back and talk about. Or the stories within the talks. The mountain lion that's going all the way across 1,900 kilometers all the way to Connecticut. It was a murder mystery. It was like a CSI documentary laid out for you and you were following along. You know? When Kevin starts talking about the canyons and how he was sort of investigating what was going on, again in that same way. Or you know, Mark Hebelwhite's talk. I mean, I really think it was one of the best 15-minute talks I ever heard. You know, it's a lot of information packed in, but still within the narrative of a story. Because our minds are geared for that. They're geared to listen and understand stories. And when I step out of these rooms and I go out and do television work or media work or deal with my scientists at the Nature Conservancy, this is an incredibly hard skill for people to just pick up and learn when they have to do it. And my admonition right now is to practice it as much as you can while you have the time to do it. So tell stories. Think about telling stories and tell stories with conviction. It's your story. Don't give up on it. Tell it with conviction. And it's a really useful skill to have. And the best, most influential conservationists, the most influential conservation scientists often, are the ones who can tell that story. Sometimes you can't tell that story on a written stage. You know, so Michael Soule is not a particularly good speaker, as you saw. But even 20 years ago, he wasn't a very good speaker. He just wasn't. But he's a really good writer. And you read his stuff, it's good stuff. You know, you read his chapters with sort of eagerness. He had a great way of you know, parsing words. I mean, I could still recite to you things out of his book from 1985. I mean, that's because he had a way of telling a story within it, right? So it doesn't matter whether you're a good speaker or you're a good writer. It's just learn to tell that story and do it well. The second one is, you know, don't underestimate your ability to think creatively about taking your research, your basic science research, and then thinking about a model of conservation that can then scale into something real. right? So it's a hard thing to sometimes do. But when I look at the talk, so virtually every talk I sat and listened to, the way I was looking at it was instantly thinking, okay, how can I apply this? How can I now take this and just with one transformation, make it something the audience can understand, or we can make we can challenge the way something is happening. That way of transforming your research into application is a bit of a skill, and it's worth thinking about. It's worth thinking about how you take an idea and transform it into something that has resonance in the world. Not just people like it, but you can actually put it to work on the ground. And then the last one I'm going to say, which I think is the one that I'll get laughs on, because I always do when I say this, is I really am a big believer in social media. And I'm not very good at it, but I'm a real believer in it. And I take I'm surprised when I hear the resistance that comes from people out there. So Paul Beyer, the head of Society for Conservation Biology, the president of the Society for Conservation Biology, sent an email out, jokingly. I know Paul, and I'm sure he did it jokingly, that said basically, if you want to get a hold of me, don't Facebook friend me, don't send me a tweet, but if you send me a postcard, I'll respond. Something to that effect, right? He said it jokingly, but it's an idiotic joke. Because he's basically completely alienating, just such a gigantic segment of society. So if you were an ad company, if you're a company who was selling anything, if you were a for-profit company that sold anything, that segment, young adults who are socially enabled, that is gold. You would do everything in your power to find a way to engage them. That is your most important demography, right? Just before reproductive age, spending power is going up. That's where habits are formed. That's when you learn to buy, Hugo Boss jeans as opposed to Levi's. And then you're going to be a Hugo Boss jeans person for the rest of your life. Trust me on this. Companies kill to figure out that demography. And what do? Don't worry about it. Send me a postcard. Just is not going to cut it. It just breaks my heart to see it. But youth plus technology is incredible power. And if you want to be able to motivate that next generation, you need to be able to understand what they're saying, how they're saying it, and even if you don't participate in it, at least have an understanding of that conversation. And then you can say, look, I don't want to be in it. That's fine. Completely fine with it. But if you want to engage, that's the way to engage it. And it's incredibly powerful. Bill McKibben laughs at that generation, calls them the iPod idiots. iPod idiots sometimes create revolutions. And they're eager for change, and you can sort of, you can incite them that way through social media. So I really am, I can defend it now, and we can talk more about it, but I want to sort of stop with that and sort of say, look, I think we should really take a hard look at how we view the world and how we view our place in the world, and ask ourselves, are the two models of conservation we use today enough of a toolbox in order to deal with the challenges we have ahead? And then ask ourselves, are we then getting ourselves ready for what we need to do out there? How much effort are we making in translating our work into something applied? How much are we creating in terms of social communities that we can network and work with? And how good really are we as storytellers, as folks who can go out there and inspire someone to think differently? Because that's ultimately, I think, what we all hope to happen. So thank you, and I'll open this up and take a couple questions, and then we can go drink.
So I've heard all the talks for the last couple days, and I've gravitated towards some of the things that you said. And you spoke about empathy, a need for empathy, and place yourself in other people's shoes. You talked about we have to be able to influence the people that are poverty-stricken around the world. And think about the haves and the have-nots. I've been thinking about science as logical and it's cerebral. And you're bringing passion, which is kind of emotional. And a lot of the conservation issues that we have out there are people that are, it's fear-driven, it's hard to make a living.
Yeah.
Where's the bridge there? I mean, it's not just us
Yeah.
finding ways to communicate science.
It isn't, and I think we put too much effort on science in the sense that we expect science to do too much. We somehow have this incredible notion in this country that if the science was right and we just explained the science logically, all of a sudden people would make rational decisions based on that. And we know that we don't, not for just stuff like climate change, which might be controversial, but for stuff like smoking or obesity. I mean, like simple stuff. People do bad things to themselves all the time, right? So it's not so amazing. And it shouldn't be surprising that it takes a while for, what is cutting-edge science, which you might all think, well, that we already knew that 10 years ago, for it to then permeate culture. I just read a really phenomenal book called The Destiny of a Republic. And it's got this incredible scene in it where President Garfield, he's the fourth president after Lincoln, gets shot in the railroad station, right? So Garfield gets shot, the assassin shoots him with a single bullet in his back. Guy falls on lands right there. Now, 70 days later, he dies. And in the autopsy, he ends up dying not because of the bullet, which was safely tucked away in his body, but because of a massive, massive infection. They pulled out a pint of pus from around his liver, okay? This was bad. The guy suffered terribly and died. All right. Now, what was amazing was that the first doctor who came upon him, seconds after he was shot, said to everyone, just turned him over, looked at the wound and said, "Stand back, everyone. Don't touch him. Don't do anything." Right? And a few minutes after this guy was basically attending to Garfield, and this was a doctor who had studied under Lister and understood the methods of Lister, which was a brand new revolutionary thing that was spreading around Europe at that time, kind of new in America, not very well accepted in America, but already accepted in Europe, where there was these little things called germs that you couldn't see, and that you had to wash yourself with carbolic soap and carbolic, to a great extent before touching anything, because germs might kill you, kind of like climate change, right? Can't see it, it's there, oh my God. So he's saying, stay back, and then all of a sudden, in comes another doctor by the name of Bliss. And Dr. Bliss so happened to be the surgeon who attended Lincoln when Lincoln was shot, right? So Bliss shows up, and Bliss is this old-time dude, and he loves to go into his ward wearing his lab coat that was so stained with blood that it was black, and as he would lean over the patients, it would crinkle up, and little flecks of blood would fall down on the patient as a mark of distinction, that he was a surgeon who had butchered many, many people before him. So Bliss comes in. The first thing Bliss does is he inserts his finger to his knuckle into the wound, right there on the station floor. The guy didn't have a chance. Of course he was going to die. 10 years after that, if Garfield had been shot, he would have most likely have survived and gone on to create a huge amount of change very early in our country's history that would have changed how emancipation actually came to being realized by African Americans in this country. Interesting side note to it, the first surgeon who came upon him was black. It was a black Union soldier who was also a surgeon, but was dismissed by them because he had radical new ideas. Science, as Chris has often told me, is mute without society providing it a bedrock that it can then flourish upon. And I think we should understand that, because that'll give us the good sense of where the limitation of science is. Joel. You can just yell it if you want, and I can. Yes, sir. Joel.
You're here, Society of Conservation Biology meetings. Michael made a distinction yesterday between conservation biology. We all know conservation biology has the adjective conservation in front. So we think of conservation biology as a discipline that's scientific. Kevin said we simplify things by making either or, but I'm going to be simple. If our society is failing or not doing the job that we want it to do, we need to focus more on the conservation part. What are people supposed to do in this society as they think forward their role? Do we change the society?
You know, in my opinion, you know, I don't want to underplay the importance of science unnecessarily. I'm taking this out of Kevin's talk, but you know, I think the dichotomies are here not terribly useful. So there's clearly good science can help you very much understand the path forward. And you can see that in several of the talks here today, you can sort of see that path being laid out by the science. And I think that our society kind of accepts that and then is astonished that there isn't change. And I'm just saying that there's one more step. And it's leaving this piece out there that's the part that makes me not feel particularly welcome in the society. And I don't think it is particularly welcoming to our colleagues at WCS or WWF or, you know, it's mostly academia and scientists from academia who go to these meetings. And I ask myself, why is that? I mean, we are the practitioners of this thing. We're the ones, more than anyone, who are actually going out there and using the science to do something, right? So using that science to do something. So shouldn't we have a voice in that society or a real role in that society? And I feel like that's the piece that I just don't feel like it does it well enough. It's partly to do with how it's governed. It's partly to do with the journal itself, which then kind of defines it a little bit, which is clearly a science-based, it's a science journal. And it doesn't give enough space to this radical notion that you know, you got to figure out a way to take that science and then apply it in clinical trials, get the results, and then scale it up. Do you want to say something about this? Because I know or no?
I mean,
Or you want to
it's an open question. What I'm wondering about as I'm hearing you.
This is Chris Velarde, by the way, for those of you who don't know, from the American Museum of Natural History.
As I'm hearing you speak and just sort of listening to Joel's question, I think a little bit about scale. You know, the society started in many of our professional lifetimes and was a small endeavor at first that grew very, very rapidly to encompass many disciplines, many types of scientific perspectives. And I think now, like the Nature Conservancy, we're all trying to save the world. And I wonder if sometimes that really cripples our ability to actually do the things that are going to make a real difference. Right? So one of the things I think that didn't come out because you're thinking on this global scale is that a lot of the best conservation comes through collective action, very local collective action. And that kind of collection action can be heavily and deeply guided by the type of science that's done in the society. But often, I think nowadays, and much of the science that comes out, everyone's trying to apply it on very huge scales. And that's good for us, right? It's good for guiding us. But when it comes to implementation, it's usually human collective action that we're trying to influence and trying to have that science guide in terms of the decision making, and that happens on very local scales. So the legislative thing and that small toolbox, yes, on the global scale, but and I wonder whether if we shift that scale to more local to these groups of collectively acting human beings, which varies by landscape, it varies based on biology, on social mores, on geography. Maybe by thinking about those shifts, we may be able to be more effective. You know, our science is a guide, right? It's one way of telling us how the world is. It doesn't tell us what we ought to do, and it doesn't tell us what we should do. But most of us in this room kind of know that. We have that in us, and we certainly know it on certain scales, right? I don't know about the world. I don't know what we should do about global warming and all that stuff, but you know, in the places where I work, I have a really good idea of how to make some positive change. So maybe it is a bit of an issue of scale and kind of maybe outgrowing what kind of sometimes seems like that quaint paper that Michael wrote with the little, you know, the medical metaphor back in, what was it, 1986 or whatever. I mean, I wonder whether it's an issue of scale, both philosophically and in terms of how we apply ourselves within our lives.
Dan?
So one of the reasons that I got involved in conservation biology many, many years ago was that I really thought that it was going to bring together people and nature.
people and science, the social sciences and the hard sciences. And it really hasn't done that very much, to my mind. And I think a big part of it is who we are. And people who get into these kinds of fields like to be up there on a mountain by themselves. They're not particularly outgoing folks. Many of them are like Michael, frankly, not a very good speaker, incredible writer, but we don't have a lot of good communicators. You're one of them, fantastic. But there aren't a lot of them out there, and we wonder why people don't listen to what we say if we don't say it clearly, if we don't say it passionately, if we don't say it in a way that resonates with local people, like you say, Chris. I mean, conservation is got to be bottom up if it's going to work. The neat thing that I've seen with the Nature Conservancy and the sea change in the Nature Conservancy over the last 30 years has been to working with local communities to make things happen.
Right.
And that's here in Montana and around the world.
Right.
But yeah, I have often struggled with the idea, we get these people doing great science and they always want us to bring in some of the social science with these graduate students or with these faculty projects.
Right.
Well, that whole area of social science is so broad, integrating them in one person doesn't work very well. And I've often thought a better approach would be to join a social scientist and a biological scientist at the hip.
Yeah.
And have them go out and address the same problem, but from two different angles, and then bring them back together at the end.
That would be cool.
But if we ignore people, we've lost.
Yes, sir.
I kind of wonder maybe one of the obstacles that prevents the conservationists and environmentalists from resonating with the public that isn't in that frame of mind is how we describe the worst case scenario.
Right.
So you talked about how there's all these predictions of the death of the world, and I think one of you mentioned how you use medical analogies, and really the world isn't going to die. People are going to go on. It's just the quality of life is going to get a lot worse if we don't do the things that we as a movement want to do. And so there might be this kind of disbelief on the other end of what we're trying to say because we're using these sort of extreme language to try to get people to do stuff, and I wonder if that might be counterproductive.
I think others have made that same point, and I think there's a genuine argument about that, about how much doom and gloom you want to throw up front, and whether you're overselling your case, and if that actually doesn't come back to bite you. There's an interesting book out by Emma Maris. She writes for Nature often, and it's called A Rambunctious Garden. And it's an interesting book because, Emma sort of rejects this notion that you look back at any particular time in history and say, we're going to then recreate that. So we've lost these things, so we're going to bring it back. So we always have these baselines that we set backwards. And she says, now, that era is now over. It's much more productive and useful to look forward and actually create a rambunctious garden. So not well manicured and tended, but still nonetheless a human influence garden that is what is going to be defined out there. It's not whether you like it or not. It's an interesting book that sort of has some of those elements about what you're saying. So you're absolutely right. Yes?
I see one of the biggest problems in communicating science to the public in a way that affects the way people think about things is the issue of uncertainty. And I'm not sure how to deal with this, but uncertainty in science is something that scientists all recognize is an essential part of the whole process. Everything is uncertain. It's all couched in terms of probabilities, and that's the way it ought to be, because that's the way the world is. But then when that gets out into the public arena, it just looks too fuzzy, or it looks like, well, people can make it say whatever they want. And then when scientists try to simplify their message so that they can communicate, they're criticized by their peers for not expressing all of the uncertainty. So do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that even scientists don't understand, risk that well. and how to communicate that. I mean, I think that's absolutely right. I think general public, if you ask them simple questions like, do you like to fly in planes? Or, real simple things like that, where we know the numbers and we know what the risks are, you'll see incredible overestimations and underestimations just based on perception. So we know that humans have a hard time really sort of understanding and making decisions based on risk. And so I think that you're making a very good point when we talk about alternate scenarios or what might happen if this goes on. How we do that has to be very thoughtful if we want a desired outcome at the end of the day. I genuinely think most people on the planet don't actually understand risk. And
Most people seem to think that science gives you hard answers to questions. They go, what do the scientists say about that? And they want a black and white, yes and no answer. That's what politicians are looking for too, and they try to actually play that against each other.
Sure.
Well, this scientist said this, therefore it's true.
Sure.
But the scientists probably didn't say that. They probably said, what is the probability X that this is true?
Sure. But I will say that, you're right. But the one thing I would not advocate is for us to then play that game. So I do think it is important, if you are making your living as a scientist, if you call yourself a scientist, that you are, as best to your ability, sticking, or at least being clear about what you're saying. I know of people, and I've seen people, once the camera is turned on, they'll say anything. And it's kind of an amazing thing to watch. All of a sudden, they'll say anything. Just because there's this need to please the TV audience, there's this need to please, and so you just put yourself out. So I do agree with you, and I would sort of caution how far, as a scientist, you want to go down that path. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Throughout my career, I've tried various pathways to trying to make progress on the things that I think everybody in this room really cares about.
Right.
And I think one of the, I've been involved in an agency, I've been involved in a national conservation organization, I have people in my family who are politicians, and all have sort of the same objective. One of the things that I've coming to realize at this late stage is there's not a yellow brick road leading to that. That's only one path. Mm-hmm. I think that we should embrace, multiple paths to trying to achieve the objective, and not say that the two paradigms that you laid out, and there are other ones too, mm-hmm. Are the only two paths. There are all kinds of ways of making success, and there are all kinds of scales that people can work at to be successful. You can, and people have different skills and talents. Some people are great communicators like yourself, and others are good scientists. And are good at trying to figure out things. So all those things are important, and I think that the mistake that we make is too frequently is thinking that there's only one right way.
I agree with you, but I also think that if students were to ask me this question, I would still argue and say, look, you really do want to learn how to communicate and be a good communicator, and you can learn it. So this is bullshit that you think that you're born with it. I go and give talks to thousands of people all the time. Trust me, I work hard at it, really hard. As a kid, I was just horribly shy, painfully shy. I couldn't tell you the stories. Coke bottle glasses, long hair, got beat up every day, extraordinarily very skinny. There was a lot of challenges. But you kind of worked. I sort of worked at it, and taught a lot, and focused on how to tell stories. Now, of course, there's some people who have gifts in certain areas, but I do think that this notion that we can't create better storytellers from our students, I think we can, and I think you can learn to do that, and it will make your work more enjoyable, relevant, useful to a broader audience. I agree with you on the multiple paths. So there's no single, I totally agree with that. But I do think that there are skills that you can learn. And being good at giving talks and presenting something is absolutely one of them. So take one more, and then I think.
So there's a great big, just in terms of thinking about marketing ourselves as a movement. There's a great big market that a lot of big corporations have figured out, but I'm not sure that we have, and that's children, kids, young kids. Are we accessing them? How can we do it better?
Yeah, so here's the cool thing about KID. So this is the place where I think, like, man, I mean, if I was in grad school, like if I was going to grad school today, I'd put a lot of effort into this. So it turns out that education's a big deal, as you very well know, right? It's not just a big deal in this country, it's a big deal around the world. And it turns out that the couple of things that are going on in education that are kind of revolutionary, like really revolutionary. The first thing that is happening is that education is more and more being delivered through interactive platforms. So smart boards, Promethean, there's a whole slew of these. And they're interactive technologies that allow you to bring content into classrooms. Now it sounds you're like, oh my God, I can't believe they're doing that. What about a good teacher? Yeah, you still need a good teacher. But this is a way in which, if you are a kid in Kenya and you're trying to study physics, would you rather get physics from that local teacher, or would you want to get it from MIT? It's as simple as that. And today, you can. You can actually, when I studied chemistry, this is a true story, I didn't actually know what a test tube was until I was quite old, because the teacher had this habit of saying, take a test tube. And he would start every class that way. You know, take a test tube and put sodium in it, and then phosphorus in it, or whatever. You know, he'd go on with the experiment. But we didn't actually know what a test tube was. It was until much, much later in life that I realized that a test tube is actually a glass vessel in which a chemical reaction occurs. I thought it was like a saying you say. Like, I'm really not lying. I mean, this is absolutely true. And I learned, you know, I mean, my junior, until high school, it was a village school that I went to. I mean, really, you know, when I mean village school, I mean, like, I was the only kid who wore shoes in my school. Like, only kid who wore shoes in my school. Some days I didn't come home with my shoes. Someone else did. So where am I going with this? So education's being delivered using interactive platforms increasingly. It's the fastest growing segment of education is homeschooling. And it's not because people don't want to teach evolution. It's because people around the world are realizing they can pick and choose who they want to teach their kids, and they can get the best. So there's this incredible explosion. In the US alone, 30 million school kids get their lesson plans from Discovery Education. Just Discovery Corporation alone sends out 30 million. It's extraordinarily a powerful movement that is happening today. And what's cool about it is any of you can access it. So you can take science, you can take research, you can take outreach, and so long as you can figure out a way to get it ideally within a curriculum or within STEM standards, you can slot that in. And what's nice is it's not just the local high school who can listen to you or get your lesson plan, but any kid around the world can do it for just pennies. So I think that's like a revolution going on out there, and I think we absolutely in conservation biology ought to tap that. It's just set for us to really create a movement. The second thing that's going on is even cooler, which is this notion of sort of flipping classrooms, which comes along when you start using interactive lesson plans. So a lot of teachers now are using this really kind of clever method where they're having kids go home and do passive exercises. So watch a video, watch a lesson online. And then in class, they're actually doing hands-on stuff. So the teacher is actually working with the kids in class, doing very hands-on stuff, instead of just being up there kind of blah, blah, blah lecturing, which doesn't, many studies show retention rates are incredibly small. So those two things are happening. And I'm glad you asked that, because for me, that is one of the coolest things that's going out there that I really see as a huge pipeline for hope. In terms of getting the word out there. So look, thanks so much for coming out here and sticking here with this. We want to give a big thanks to the Montana chapter of SCB. Kevin was commenting about right, how impressive it was, and the commitment and the phenomenal talks that we heard over the last couple of days. So thanks again, and thanks, Julie.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sanjan. As an aspiring conservationist and aspiring conservation biologist, I appreciate the advice, and I enjoyed the conversation. And I just want to take a second to say thank all of you for coming, and I thought all the talks were excellent. I want to express sincere gratitude to you, Sanjan, and to Kevin, and to Michael, and to Scott, and to all of the speakers. Thanks a lot. And I'll see you guys all at Brooks and Brown's in about 15, 20 minutes.